They were the blasts that shook China and sent shockwaves around the world. Just before midnight on August 12, 2015, two explosions ripped through a chemical storage station in Tianjin, around 160 kilometers from Beijing.
We start the program with a blast in North China's port city.
Once the smoke cleared, the scale of devastation was enormous. Nearly 200 people were killed, hundreds more were injured, apartments were reduced to burnt-out shells, and businesses were left reeling with billions of dollars worth of damage. While the images on TV news in China and around the world depicted similar scenes of destruction, there were noticeable discrepancies in the coverage by China's national broadcaster CCTV News and US cable network CNN International. This research report examines those differences based on a content analysis of news stories in the 2 weeks following the disaster. News framing has been extensively used to investigate the ways in which the media structures news. By selecting what to include or exclude from a story, the news media define a story's meaning to audiences, thus shaping people's interpretation of events. Communications scholar Robert Entman's definition of news framing is particularly useful for this study. According to Entman, framing essentially involves selection and salience. To frame is to select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in a communicating text, in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and/or treatment recommendation for the item described. News framing is especially important in disaster communication, with researchers noting it plays an important role in setting public perceptions and amplifying risks to the public. This study is guided by the following research questions. First, how did CCTV News frame the Tianjin Blasts? And second, how did CNN International frame the same event? To answer these questions, the following hypotheses are proposed. First, the Tianjin Blasts were framed differently in news stories by CNN International and CCTV News. Second, the use of sources was different among CNN International and CCTV News in their coverage of the Tianjin Blasts. And finally, CNN International and CCTV News held different valances towards the government's post-disaster response. There are three main categories of research variables in this study: news frames, sources, and valence. The framing categories are loss, threat, cause, responsibility, solution, and others, including the human interest frame. The analysis of sources is based on their chronological order in news stories. Subcategories of sources include military or emergency services personnel, political actors, local residents and witnesses, experts, and others. The valence refers to each story's stance and tone toward the government's post-disaster response and is defined as either positive, negative, or neutral. While China has one of the world's highest rates of disasters, scholars have noted there is a lack of domestically relevant, culturally sensitive studies into disaster communication in China. Moreover, its unique media landscape means findings relevant in the West are not necessarily applicable to China. Historically, the mass media in China has been known to serve as a mouthpiece for the ruling Communist Party. However, the country's media has undergone rapid transformation since reform and opening up began in 1978. The rise of CCTV News is symbolic of this transformation. Since its launch in 2000, it has grown to compete with international media outlets under the influence of globalization. With studios in Beijing, Washington, and Nairobi, Kenya, the network and its affiliates have a global audience reach of 85 million viewers in more than 100 countries and regions. With the easing of state control, Chinese journalism has become more aggressive, even though government censors still have the final say. Analysts note CCTV News strives to strike a clear yet delicate balance, to become the go-to channel for breaking news while adhering to its social responsibility by upholding national interests. Launched in 1985, CNN is the first 24-hour news network in the US and the parent network of CNN International. In addition to its TV broadcasts that reach more than 182 million households worldwide, its website CNN.com is one of the most visited news websites in the world. CNN has a checkered history in China, however, where obstruction of reporting politically sensitive issues is common and stories are periodically blacked out. These tensions came to light during coverage of the Tianjin Blasts.
And it would seem that security officials there,
even if those on the Chinese side were sometimes misidentified.
this is something that has happened many times over the years in any number of stories in China.
The empirical materials from CNN International and CCTV News were both obtained from their websites. Stories were sourced by using the keyword Tianjin, while results were refined to the broadcast dates corresponding to the study period. A total of 50 news stories from CCTV News and 25 stories from CNN International have been analysed. Each news story is a unit of analysis in this study. 14 variables have been developed based on the research questions and hypotheses. During the framing analysis, the loss frame was found to be most dominant in CNN International's coverage, while the solution frame was the most common among CCTV News reports. Accounting for 29% each, the second most used frames for CNN International and CCTV News were the threat and loss frames respectively. In the first week after the blasts, the loss frame was most dominant on CNN International and CCTV News, as both focused on the climbing death toll and the number of people missing. In the following week, the solution and responsibility frames became more common on CCTV News and CNN International respectively. The cause frame was found in less than 10% for both network stories about the blasts, reflecting ambiguity about what sparked the disaster. The human interest frame was employed in several CCTV News stories about a 19-year-old firefighter rescued from the disaster zone 2 days after the Tianjin Blasts. It was also identified in stories about volunteers. The solution frame was overwhelmingly the most common frame for CCTV News, accounting for 40% of the total. This was evident through its coverage of the relief efforts, including treatment for hospitalised victims and the containment and cleanup of chemicals. Where the solution frame was identified in CNN International news stories, such as the authorities' efforts to clean up sodium cyanide, it often focused on the challenges and at times included grim commentary.
David, I don't know, but
it's frightening. It's frightening what's happened. It's frightening what's still ahead. Thank you so much for your expertise.
You're very welcome.
Turning to sources, political actors were the most dominant primary source for CCTV News, appearing in 39% of news stories. Local residents and witnesses accounted for 57% of primary sources for CNN International, far more than CCTV News at 5%. The high presence of local residents and witnesses in CNN International news stories reflects a dominant loss frame in its coverage, with many stories focusing on witness accounts in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, followed by displaced residents' bid for compensation for their destroyed homes. It can be concluded from these findings that the prominence of authorities, both military and government officials, as sources on CCTV News highlighted the positive aspects of the post-disaster response. Finally, different valences towards a government's post-disaster response were indeed conveyed in news stories on CNN International and CCTV News. 48% of stories on CNN International had a negative valence compared to 52% of stories having a positive valence on CCTV News. Both networks had a similar proportion of stories that held a neutral valence. CNN International had 44% compared to 42% for CCTV News. So, what does the current study suggest about how the media constructs their audience's understanding of disasters? It is clear from this research that the emphasis of certain news frames, sources and valences contributed to different interpretations of the Tianjin Blasts by CNN International and CCTV News. The tendency by CCTV News to use authority figures as sources and the solution frame in its coverage shaped the positive valence of its reporting about the government's post-disaster response. News framing is influenced by a country's media system as well as the ideology under which that media system operates. Although news values have long been developed to objectively provide high-quality news stories for audiences, editors and journalists are still personally subjective when deciding what to cover and how to cover it. The high showing of the neutral valence by both CNN International and CCTV News suggests two things. First, journalistic objectivity holds currency in an increasingly competitive globalized media environment. For CCTV News, being viewed as a trusted news source to an international audience is as important as its ideological objectives. Secondly, the notion that CNN is an anti-China force isn't reflected by its coverage.
That if I feel for my own personal safety I should wear a mask, I will wear one whether I'm on the air or off. But I wouldn't wear a mask on camera, in part because we don't want to be sensational and try to make it sound like things are more dangerous than they are.
Of particular interest in this study is the low use of the responsibility frame at 4% by CCTV News. When it was used by the network, responsibility was attributed to the chemical station's owners rather than local government officials, whom CNN International accused of criminal negligence. This finding suggests that CCTV News is still more of a guard dog for the party state rather than a watchdog. This study's sample size could have been increased to include other media, and the study period could have been lengthened to research how frames changed over time. Another limitation of this study is that deductive coding of the frames was employed based on assigned categories. Inductive coding of the frames would deepen the analysis of cross-cultural differences across frame categories. Future research could examine the influence of social media in shaping people's understandings of disaster.
Now, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube are all blocked in China, but in their place are services similar to them, but with Chinese characteristics.
This research area would be particularly interesting in China, where social media and traditional media on one side vie with the government and censors on the other side in framing post-disaster narratives. Finally, an audience reception analysis could be used to gain a deeper understanding of how audiences interpret disasters through news. Thank you for listening and allowing me to share my research report thus far.